Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Anxiety 101 series, a part of Seattle Children's Impact Project. My name is Kendra Reed, and I'm a clinical psychologist. In this video, we're going to be talking about challenging your anxious thoughts. Now, we have previously talked about the relationship between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And in the most recent video, we talked about identifying what we're thinking in situations when we feel anxious. So in this video, we pick up where we left off. So once we've identified what we're thinking in situations when we feel anxious, what do we do about it? So one thing that you can do is you can challenge those anxious thoughts, because anxiety tends to do a couple of things. One thing that anxiety tends to do is it tends to overestimate the likelihood that something bad is going to happen. So essentially making us believe that the bad thing is going to happen more often than the evidence from real life really tells us. And anxiety also tends to make us underestimate our ability to cope. So it tends to make us feel like we can't really handle feeling anxious or handle hard things. So, and often these are not helpful and not true thoughts. So we can ask ourselves a series of questions in order to become more critical consumers of even our own thoughts. So there are some questions you can ask yourself once you've identified what your anxious thoughts are. I've given some examples up here, and there are likely other questions that you could ask yourselves once you identify your anxious thought. So some questions you might ask yourself are, do I know for sure that this is going to happen? What has happened before? What else might happen? And those questions tend to help us arrive at the answer to the following question, which is, what will probably happen? So of all of the possible events, what is the most likely thing to happen? Another question that you could ask is, even if that thing I'm worried about happens, could I cope with that? What evidence do I have that I could still cope and be okay and handle that situation? Another question is, what's the worst thing that can happen? That one tends to sound kind of flip, but we mean it honestly. Like, what do we think is the worst thing that could come out of this situation of, for example, answering a question incorrectly on your test? And even asking ourselves, am I falling into a common thinking trap? So that, like I mentioned in the previous videos, can just be a little bit of a shortcut to coping. So am I noticing that thing again, where I'm overestimating danger, or I'm fortune telling what's going to happen, which tends to help us identify a shortcut to coping. So once you've asked yourselves these questions, you can help yourself come up with a coping thought or a more rational response to an anxious thought. So these thoughts are kind of the responses to the anxious thought. They're the thoughts that kind of help us more accurately weigh the evidence that we have for the situation. So you can do two things. The first one, and the one that tends to be more helpful, especially for older youth and teens, is to use the thought challenging exercise that we've just gone over in order to come up with a thought that is more true or helpful and specific to your anxiety provoking situation that you are thinking about right now. The other thing you can do if you feel stuck, or for younger participants who might find all of this metacognitive stuff kind of difficult, is to pick a common coping thought to use as a sort of mantra to help get you through some common situations that might make you feel anxious. So things like, nobody's perfect, everybody makes mistakes, or it's probably not as bad as I'm predicting it's going to be. Or one of my favorite ones is, that's just anxiety talking. One of the really helpful things we can do is kind of externalize anxiety by naming it anxiety or something else. You could name it after a character in a book, or a movie or a TV show, something to give it a name to separate anxiety from you. And then when anxiety is talking and saying, hey, this really hard thing is going to happen, you can say, that's anxiety talking right now. So that can be a really helpful activity to do, and a way of sorting through your anxious thoughts from your other thoughts. So take a minute and take some time to track some of the anxious thoughts that come up for you and practice coming up with more rational responses or coping thoughts. And you can start to acknowledge or track rather what happens next. So as you go through this exercise. Thanks again for joining us for this video, and be sure to check out Seattle Children's website for more Impact Project videos.